Hello, I'm Adam Sutherland and I'm the director of Grizedale Arts, and I can't quite work out how to make a short film of myself doing this introduction, so we'll have to make do with this. So I'm going to move straight on to the recorded talk, and I will see you all for a Q&A at the end. Hope you enjoy it. Here are some images of the Lake District of England. Grizedale Arts is based at Lawson Park, the farm you can see in the bottom right-hand slide, which is itself based in the Grizedale Forest, which is a Forestry Commission plantation, pretty much in the middle of the Lake District. Lake District is famous for Romanticism. It's a very intense cultural centre in many ways, or historically it has been, and it's also very sort of understood in a way as being a sort of spiritual heartland of England. I think perhaps now it is rather more understood as a tourist destination, and in that sense also understood in quite a simplistic way as a beautiful place that has not a great deal more than the fact that it's a beautiful place to offer. So that has been that notion has slightly informed the way that Grizedale as an organisation has evolved, and particularly under my directorship, the idea of generating culture, that of replacing or reinvigorating traditional histories, and creating export, something that goes out of the region, that this place is not merely a receiving house for other cultures and other ideas, and for guests and visitors and people to look rather than participate. So historically, Grizedale Arts started back in the 1970s as a land art, public art space. It perhaps was interesting in that it didn't actually attempt to be a visitor attraction, and perhaps its success as a visitor attraction was partly due to that. The artists, it was an opportunity really to giving artists to work within an industry based on another program that was running in Britain at the time, placing artists in industry. So the industry here was the Forestry Commission, and the artists had the opportunity to use the plantations as a kind of studio. Notably, the first artist that came was David Nash, and David Nash in many ways set the blueprint that many artists then followed. The sculptures were in fact discovered by people, and that was very important in terms of people's engagement. So people didn't really understand that this was art they were going to look at. They just came across things in the forest, in the woods, and found them curious. And it built and became a very popular, successful art project, and which in 1990 won the Prudential Prize for the Arts, which is a big prize in the UK, still running, and a big chunk of money. One of the problems with this program after its initial innovation was that it didn't really evolve or change. And when I was brought into Grizedale, it was with the remit to reinvent. I think the history really was of the sculpture in the forest did play quite an important role in the development of public art in the UK. As we now understand public art. But that moved away from the rural very quickly, and the Grizedale programme was quite closely replicated in a more urban environment in Gateshead, and generally in the north of England. I often think that something like Anthony Gormley's Angel of the North was the kind of, in a way, culmination of a lot of work that emanated from Grizedale. Certainly a lot of the same people were involved in making that project happen. But by the time I arrived, the project was probably rather on its last legs. It had two rather short-lived directors, and I think was on the point of having the funding that it received from the Arts Council withdrawn, and it needed to re-establish, I guess, a connection with the contemporary. It had lost, as they say, traction with a lot of what was going on in the art world at that time. So I started work at Grizedale 20 years ago, and my first instinct was to kind of re-establish what I think I understood as honesty, and to be honest about the place and what it was and the people that lived here and the way that artists responded to it and all that sort of thing. So one of the first things I did was to rename a lot of the things within the centre, within the forest, which everything had been called something in the forest. So there was a gallery in the forest, and the gallery in the forest was renamed the gallery in the car park, because that actually much more closely represented what it was. It was in the middle of a very large car park. And the same went for an awful lot of things. But I think that was indicating a kind of approach to the rural, and a sort of return to let's be real about the rural. I am from a farming background myself. I was very keen to leave that behind, and in many ways I was very keen to come back to it. But I have a very ambivalent relationship with the rural, both the positive aspects of it and the negative. Initially, my reinvention was quite confrontational and brought a lot of what one might think of as fashionable artists into the context of the program, and we revived a lot of, we reinterpreted a lot of existing rural tropes like country shows. We even did a project where people got married, and we brought quite a lot of controversy to the forest in many ways. And during that period, the relationship with Forestry Commission, particularly, which was always difficult to generate it, they felt that we weren't bringing tourists to the centre, that we were dealing with subjects that weren't particularly things they wanted to talk about or expose, and so eventually we kind of agreed a divorce, and they took the sculpture park and I took a derelict farmhouse. So briefly, here are a few things that the Forestry Commission weren't so keen on, and I would say a wider public, particularly kind of local visiting tourism public, didn't really enjoy. Very popular in the art world, and lots of artists established their reputations based on this period of Grizedale's history. Anyway, moving on, let's have a look at the building that we took on in exchange for all this, which was this. This was Lawson Park. So quite a fascinating building. Its history, earliest records 1338. It came with 15 acres of upland, pretty hopeless agriculturally. I think that there might have been a early attempt at agricultural settlement here by the Furness Abbey monks, who were largely Cistercian, but before them there was an order of Sauvignac monks whose specialism really was cultivating marginal land, and I have a feeling that Lawson Park might have been part of that, possibly unsuccessful. But its principal history was as a centre for charcoal burning, and that was in order to facilitate iron smelting in the valley. So this was a really industrial valley back in the 14th and 15th century. It then turned to sheep farming, relatively unsuccessfully. Its sort of most notable 19th century history was that it was bought by John Ruskin as part of the Brantwood estate right at the end of Ruskin's life, and he took a strong interest in the farm and the people farming there, but it was very subsistence farming, very unsuccessful. And after 1900 it more or less fell out of use, a brief return to cultivation during the war, but again not very successfully. And when we acquired it, it was entirely derelict. And so we set about initially redeveloping it as a building that we could use. Um, and yeah, I think somehow there were some mistakes in that. We went through a process with the Arts Council and a full design team, and there was a slight sense of the kind of idea of a vision being foisted, or let's say a big vision for the whole project, which in retrospect, I feel was a mistake, that the whole project should have evolved more organically, which it eventually did do, but initially we had this big push to convert the building so that we could use it. And then over the years, it's evolved. So it was more in conjunction with communities and with conjunction with a very large cross-section of people, from artists to local communities. One of the key things we were interested in was a shift from encouraging artists to make art in this interesting context and then promoting that art to local people, to a wider community, and most successfully, of course, to the art world. And the shift we went through when we started working at Lawson Park was that we would no longer make the invitation to the artist, that we would wait for invitations from the community to do specific projects, things that people actually wanted to happen and were the projects that people were properly engaged with. And that, it seems like a really simple change, but actually really vital in terms of the value really in what we're doing, and the interest and the involvement, the participation from communities. So that Lawson Park was kind of part of that shift, uh, but largely it was generated by the arts organisation. And I think in many ways what we were trying to do was demonstrate that through the arts you could take on a building which had been abandoned and was, local advice was don't go near it. You'll never get that working, and to demonstrate that through a sort of creative process and creative working, that it could be, you could generate something that did work. And there was a different way of using these resources, and fundamentally that ambition was making the most of the existing resources and evolving and developing those resources. So that really keys into the idea of working to invitation. So in terms of the local community, we worked to invitation to then develop aspects within the local village in a very similar way to how we developed Lawson Park. So these are the ingredients, and this is a more creative way of putting them together that works and generates productive and economically viable solutions. So Lawson Park, this is, you see an image of the gardens here, basically hacked out of some very unbiodiverse land at 600 feet above sea level, never really been properly cultivated. And over 20 years, in fact, that we've been working on the gardens, we've managed to generate, we've built soil. That's the most important thing. We've created soil, and that's created the biodiversity and the range, and in fact now the kind of richness. In fact, we slightly find Lawson Park a little bit embarrassing in a way, because it's become a bit too much of a kind of luxury hotel look, rather than something that's sort of been made out of nothing. Some images from the interior of the building. As you can see, as I was mentioning, it's like luxury hotel look. Slightly embarrassing, but not really the intention. But if you keep going at something for long enough, it just sort of gets a bit like that. So the interiors are generated through our collections policy. So we set up a number of aesthetics that we wanted to represent in the building, which are drawn from local aesthetics as we'd identified them. And we set up a number of collection headings, which were mostly to do with design and design movements that felt that through design they would change the world and improve the world. So everything in the building has some kind of resonance and significance. There is no actual design going on. It is literally a collection of things that are in use. So it's as a collection, it acts as a real inspiration to a lot of people that come here, and a lot of people will key into the collection before they come here, in fact, and that will be one of the reasons that the things that they've strands of content that they follow up on. Nothing is of huge value. Most things were bought from second-hand sites, from were gifted, or there's a few artist commissions within the building. But yeah, it's a rich and complex collection. You can find out more about it online. Here's a few images from the outside. Lots of different artists, lots of different architects, designers, gardeners, all sorts. It's very much a collective effort that generates the interiors and the exteriors of the building, and is in a constant state of evolution. And then a few images of food. These are from some time ago. But yeah, so we generate quite a lot of food. It's quite an important part of the program that people are involved in growing. I guess the whole project has a kind of symbolic relevance to the ambitions of the organisation and how we more generally work. So, as I briefly mentioned earlier, from the base of Lawson Park and the organisation of Grizedale Arts, we became involved with the Coniston Institute by the invitation of the Institute Committee. And this is an amazing and very interesting building with an extraordinary history. There's some images of it here back more or less when it was built, 1878, I think it was. And the opening of the Ruskin Museum a few years later. The ambition of it's a mechanics institute, so it's really its ambition is to be an education centre, or a form of education for local people, working people. And the museum was set up very much in that light as well. And around the building, which was very multifunctional, had a bathhouse in it, for example, and a shop, and there's a very diversified offer, a little bit like a 1970s art centre. But yeah, around that, they also developed a series of schools, craft schools principally, lace making, wood carving, and metal repoussé, all quite simple crafts that people could quite quickly pick up and then develop and get better at. A lot of it was initially designed by artists, and then as people became more competent, they took it up. But the ambition of the schools was to an enhanced form of education. It was to help people develop. It also really worked as a real arts and crafts movement, in that people were able to make things they could sell, but also that they could afford to keep. So it wasn't particularly high end. It was all fairly everyday and workaday in many ways. There's an additional image here of the Migratory Dairy School, which was a fascinating project, which was actually established during the late 19th century Depression, and was a peripatetic school that taught farmers how to produce, pack and send butter by train to major centres. So yeah, kind of again, like all the schools, very successful. Or most of the schools kind of petered out in the during the Second World War. What we tried to do, so I should say, we were invited by the Institute Committee to help them reinvent the building, and so that some of the ideas were about turning it into a conference facility and knocking it down, turning it into housing and various other things. And what we encouraged was the renovation of the building and the making best use of what was there, but drawing from the history. And using what was really a very solid and well-built educational institution. So you can see some images here of lots of different schools that we started up. We set up a volunteer program and we started renovating the building. It's all fairly easy, straightforward, and obvious, really. In 5 or 6 years of working there, so quite durational, quite long term, quite embedded, we were able to run a huge range of really interesting dynamic projects that reinvented the building based on its sort of original uses and made it, turned it from basically point of bankruptcy and near dereliction into an organisation that was a couple of years ago turning over £250,000 a year. So really quite without grants, without any external financial assistance. So again, making use of what exists here. At which point the Institute was kind of put back on the map in terms of being an important part of the village and important part of village culture, and perhaps more importantly, important part of income. And so the end result of that really was that the parish council decided that it was something that they should take a stronger hand in, and there was perhaps less need for an arts organisation in that, and less needs for the arts, in fact, that should be more orientated towards profit-making enterprise. So I can't say it wasn't disappointing for us, because I didn't feel like we'd really got as far as we needed to go with the project. The idea of it was about helping people think more creatively about the everyday and using art and creativity as a way to rethink what they did and how they do it. And as part of that, we encouraged people to we took people on projects that we used to do in other parts of the world. So this is an images of a project in Korea. And that's a local farmer looking out over Seoul, and this like parody of the Caspar David Friedrich, Wanderer Above the Sea of Mist, I think it's called. And the ambition there really was about people seeing how things were done in other parts of the world and being involved with us in creative projects, mostly which were about solving problems or solving economic issues. I mean, most of our projects were around trying to generate things that were of value, of use, that were valued by the communities in which they were going to exist. And the impact of that on those people who were able to come with us on those projects was that they rethought how they worked when they got back. So in a way, that was the process of kind of persuading, I suppose, or suggesting that thinking creatively was a good way to kind of break the deadlock you might find yourself in. And that was very evident with a number of people in the village. And so that started to happen. And there was a sort of transformation starting to happen at the point that we were, in effect, no longer needed. Just at the point when we were most needed, perhaps. Anyway, that was what happened, and we withdrew really from working at the Institute. Carrying on with our international program is an image from a project on the rural exhibition about rural culture that we did for Hazard and Worth in Somerset, which is a commercial gallery. But it was an opportunity for us to bring together all of the social projects that we've been engaged in over the years, but also connect up with a lot of the international projects. So bringing all of that stuff under one roof and doing a kind of history of the arts within the rural context, making the case that through the rural, some of the creative thinking is perhaps different from the way that people think in urban, or how creativity works in urban spaces. It's much more haphazard and random, and the collisions and car crashes of projects and creative ideas are generate perhaps bigger or more unusual creative leaps. Whereas in an urban context, you can kind of work with like-minded people the whole time, so it's sort of much more linear in its trajectory. But I was thinking about those kind of ideas in terms of how things evolve in rural places and how we create a culture that we can export from that rural context. There's another project which was in Ireland for the Irish Museum of Modern Art, where we generated an economy based on courgettes. So you can see in the background of the picture the courgette field with 350 courgette plants planted into a straw bale system. And for this project we invited 4 villages from around the world to contribute to building this new village in a way. So we built the economy with the intention of building the housing to service the economy once the economy was established. We didn't ever get around to building the houses, sadly. The economy worked. Of course, quite subsidised. All the setting up of it was subsidised. The courgettes were generated £10,000 a week for a short period of time, which was quite fun, quite gratifying. And that project also kind of led into another project which in Japan, and are working with one of the villages that we connected with there, and trying to rethink how that village would work in the future. So this was a school program which we are still involved with. We're still running. In this instance, we built a Slovenian bee house for beekeeping as a part of a school of beekeeping where we were utilising 3 abandoned paddy fields in a very beautiful setting. And I guess the suggestion really to the village was you can make honey, but you will have a much richer, on many levels, experience if you teach people how to keep bees. So financially, that you'll make more money, but you'll also meet a lot of interesting people, and you'll have some interaction. And one of the big issues in these in all the villages that we were involved in outside of the UK, everybody has the same issues of dwindling populations, collapsing infrastructure, aging. Basically, most extreme in Japan, where there are nobody in that village under the age of 65, and little chance of a future for that way of life and the amazing range of skills that they have beyond the next 20 years. So it's quite urgent issue, and it is reflected everywhere. Our ambitions are around generating an exchange, so that it's not really it's not necessarily saying do it this way, or this is an example of how to do things. It's people are doing things in different ways in different contexts, but everybody's kind of dealing with the same issues. This might be the wrong way to do it. It might be a better way to do it. We're not necessarily saying one thing or the other, but what we want, I think, is the idea to think more broadly about how you might address the perceived problems, and how you might see your own context in a wider perspective. And so where you sit in the world rather than where you sit in a very small community in a valley, as in our case. So I'm talking about trying to combine these different elements throughout this talk. It's been the creative, the artist culture, if you couldn't call it that, local culture, local communities, and an international perspective and international communities and culture. And how do you bring all these three components into play with one another on a kind of even playing field? So what that led us to really was purchasing this pub called, well, it's an inn, the Farmer's Arms. It's at the head of the valley in which Grizedale operates, Crake Valley, and it's been derelict for a few years. It had been very much the heart of the community. It has a similar history to Lawson Park, was most likely established by Furness Abbey monks as part of trade routes through the Lake District, and it was very much embedded in the heart of the community, as people have enormously warm memories of it. Not very diverse memories, mostly getting drunk, but yeah, they do have very warm memories of it. It also comes with 6 acres of land, and it is the gateway. And so we saw the opportunity. Again, it was by invitation, so the local community wanted to save it, and they asked us to help. And we got involved in fundraising and putting forward a vision for the site and what its role would be in the wider context. And that is very much combining all the things that I've been talking about right through this talk. I'll just briefly recap a touch on that. So making the most of what already exists, reconnecting what already exists, expanding and developing creatively on those resources. So this is one example of that, a teaching garden that we've just set up with a local farmer about 2 miles up the valley. They have given us an area of land to work with, and we've run a school to build a shelter and a garden shed with some architects you can see listed there, and now we've set up a school which meets monthly for a full day, and we've replicated that idea and that system in for a number of different projects that again are about connecting the resources of the valley. Another example would be this project with St Martin's School of Architecture, which was to build a bread oven, which is now in regular use and is a great drawing together of people, mostly to eat, but needless to say. I suspect that's my time up. I hope that's been reasonably clear. It's a very complicated picture. It is a much bigger network than I've been able to describe today, but I'm now, we're opening up for questions, so please feel free to ask whatever you like. And thank you very much for listening.